Hello, U.S. history students, and welcome to our discussion on the American Revolution. By 1776, American colonists are divided into three separate groups. You've got your loyalists who remain staunchly loyal to the British. That's 20% of the population. Then you've got your patriots who very much support separation and want independence from Britain. That's 40%. And then the other 40% are neutral. In the good old human way, they're just sitting back and watching how things play out to see which side to choose. So before we get started in the war itself, let's go back a little bit and see how we got to this place we're in anyway. So by 1750, American colonists were loyal British citizens. They were autonomous, meaning kind of ruling themselves, self-governing. They had colonial assemblies to govern themselves. They had a thriving trade connection with England as well as some other countries like France, Spain, and the Netherlands. And then the French and Indian War comes, or the 7 Years' War, depending upon what name you see. France and England are at war over territory. And England defeats them. England wins by 1763. But at that point, not only has Britain doubled their military, but they've got this huge amount of debt. Somebody's got to pay for the war, right? So the policy of salutary neglect has ended by this point. And salutary neglect is basically that time period where the British were kind of laissez-faire or not really enforcing the policies on things like supervision and trade regulations. The government in Britain kind of just let the colonies do what they wanted. But at the end of the French and Indian War, Britain starts imposing more and more political authority, raising taxes because, hey, the colonists are citizens too. They should help pay for this war. And also, we're not going to reduce our military, so we need money for that as well. And they refuse to allow colonists representation in Parliament. So they're imposing all of these taxes and all of these new laws on the colonists, but they're not allowing the colonists to have a say in what these different new things are. Also, they're going to sit here and say, okay, well, it's not safe for you to go outside of our colony boundaries. So we're going to make the Proclamation of 1763. And that says that you are not allowed to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. Colonists, again, did not get a say in where they could settle. They were just told, you can't go west of this mountain range because I said so. And then they get the Stamp Act. This is not necessarily a tax on stamps like we know stamps. It's a tax on any printed materials. So newspapers, books, pamphlets. And this is a time period where there's no radio, there's no television, there's no internet. The way these people get their news is either by word of mouth or newspapers. So this is making your printers and your editors even more angry after they've already started printing ugly things about the British government. Now they're going to start printing even more ugly things about the British government because they're angry that now they've got to pay more. Then you get also the Townsend Acts, which are a series of acts that were imposed between 1767 and 1768 that taxed anything that was considered a luxury good. So china, which like plates and teacups and things like that, glass, lead, paint, paper. So not only do you have to now pay a tax on printed items, such as newspapers, but now you've got to pay a tax on actual, just regular paper that you would write your letters on, which is how people were able to communicate in the time. So that's going to make the colonists mad. And tea. These guys are British citizens. They love their tea, and now they've got to pay even more money to get their tea than before. This makes some of the colonists so angry that they form a patriotic organization to fight the British called the Sons of Liberty, led by Sam Adams and his cousin John Adams. And then you get the Boston Massacre in 1770. And while some people say, oh, the colonists were innocent, the British fired upon them, which is the propaganda that was imposed to try to drum up support for independence, in reality, what actually happened is the colonists were taunting the British. The British were guarding a garrison, which is where they would keep their guns and their gunpowder and ammunition and everything. And the colonists in Boston were taunting them. They were throwing snowballs that had ice and rocks and clamshells in them. And we're not 100% certain. Historical record isn't clear. But the British reported that they heard somebody from behind their line, which is by some historians considered to possibly be a colonist that just went behind the British and yelled fire. Many of the British soldiers assumed that it was their leader that was saying fire, so they fired, and they fired upon the crowd of colonists. Several were killed, several were wounded, and the British were put on trial for it. And the only person that would defend the British was John Adams, because he didn't see that it was fair that they did not get a proper trial. After that, the British imposed a tax on the tea and also what we call an embargo, where only tea from the East India Company was allowed to be purchased in the colonies. So the East India Company essentially has a monopoly on tea. So the Sons of Liberty get together, dress up as Native Americans, and get on the East India Company ships and start throwing tea into Boston Harbor as an act of protest against the higher taxation, the embargo, the monopoly. This is their way of physically protesting to show the British that they're not going to stand for it. And this is 1773. After that, we get the Intolerable Acts, which is another series of acts basically saying, we're going to close Boston Harbor until you pay for our tea because, you just ruined our profit. So now you can't trade out of one of your most profitable harbors. Oh, and also, you have to let our soldiers live in your house. If they come to your house and want to stay, you have to let them. So basically, the Quartering Act, where British colonists have to allow British soldiers to stay in their homes. This also, as even more of a punishment to the colony of Massachusetts, took away their charter, which made them an independent colony and essentially makes them part of the British colonies again. So they're a royal crown colony now, and they don't get a say. They're just reduced to the kings ruling them again. And any official that was charged, British official that was charged with any capital offense, so basically any crime, didn't have to be charged in that colony. They could either be sent back to Britain or they could be sent to a different colony. And the colonists didn't feel as though this was fair because they felt as though this wasn't allowing the British soldiers or the British officials to get what they deserved, so to speak. In 1774, we create the first Continental Congress, which is a group of people that was made up of representatives from each of the colonies coming together in a convention of delegates to come up with ways to get back at the British or fight the British on all of these different things that the British are doing. This is the organization that's going to create the country of the United States. Then in 1775, we get the shot heard round the world, the Battle of Lexington and Concord. This is the beginning, the first shots of the American Revolution. After that, we get the Second Continental Congress, which basically succeeds the First Continental Congress, made up of members like Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Hancock, John Jay, who we now know as the Founding Fathers. And their job is the same or similar to the First Continental Congress, where they're just coming up with a plan of action. And then from 1775 to 1783, we're fighting the Revolutionary War. It's an 8-year, hard-fought struggle, but we end up gaining our independence from that. Within the Second Continental Congress, we also get the Declaration of Independence. And this document is basically our breakup letter listing every single reason why we're breaking up with the British. We send it to the king, and that becomes known as our ultimate founding document. So the American Revolution is really inspired by the Enlightenment period in Europe. The main people that our founders base our documents on are John Locke. This is the person that we get all men are born with natural rights and citizens can revolt from a tyrannical government. The Baron de Montesquieu, which is where we get our separation of powers and checks and balances. So we really take part of our governmental structure from him. And then Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who believed that citizens have a social contract with their government. Government's meant to protect them, citizens serve the government. And this is also where Thomas Paine gets a lot of the ideas that he uses to write Common Sense, which was a pamphlet that was distributed throughout the colonies, urging colonial independence. He's basically saying, we must break from Britain, and here's why. And most of the ideas within Common Sense are based upon these Enlightenment thinkers and distributed to the colonies so that we can look at them and say, okay, no, this makes sense. We should be pro-independence. And so in the Enlightenment period, people are trying to apply a scientific approach to society. And we're coming up with new ways of doing government and new ideas about how a government should be run. We also advocate for the use of reason to discover truths and address social issues through reason. It's a very scientific and rational thought process. The spread of these ideas then come over from Europe as more and more people are immigrating to the United States, or what becomes the United States. And those Enlightenment ideas influence the colonists. On top of the taxation after the French and Indian War, the taxation without representation, and then the shots fired at Lexington and Concord, they need something to help rally the troops, so to speak. And that one thing is, at first, Thomas Paine's Common Sense. By July of 1776, the war had been going on for months, and enough Americans had been convinced that they need to be on the side of independence, that the members of the Second Continental Congress form a committee. And that committee's sole purpose is to draft a Declaration of Independence, the breakup letter with Britain. And most people think it's just Thomas Jefferson sitting there with his pen, but that's not true. Jefferson was the primary author. The document itself is based on enlightened ideas of Locke, Rousseau, and Montesquieu. And it breaks down why the colonists are rebelling. Here are our grievances. Here's why we don't want to be part of you anymore. And the citizens can break their social contract with the government because the government's being tyrannical. They're being unfair. So the Declaration is drafted by this committee made up of Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, John Adams, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. So some really big colonial powerhouses of the day come together to create this document. And they sit down to write this document, and one of the most famous lines in it, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." Originally, that line was, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." When Jefferson gives Franklin the document to look over, because Franklin is a very good and very famous, even at that point, editor, Franklin looks at it and he's like, well, this is 3 words. Let's cross it out. Let's put self-evident. So it becomes, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." And once the document has been edited and rewritten and everybody on the committee is in agreement, it goes to vote. And the vote happens on July 2nd, 1776. And after this vote and everybody's in agreement, we should send this letter, John Adams sits down and he writes the next day a letter to his wife, Abigail. And in this letter, he says, "The 2nd day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shrews and games and sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illumination from one end of this continent to the other from this time forward forevermore," which is pretty poignant at this point because the country doesn't even go past the Allegheny Mountains. You can't settle past the Appalachians. So John Adams is basically foreshadowing the nation, saying we will eventually cover the entire continent. And it's formally adopted on July 4th of 1776, which is the date on the document and the date that we now celebrate as Independence Day. So the Declaration is a formal demand of separation, but the war had begun in 1775 in Lexington and Concord. And so once we've formally demanded independence, now we can have a formal army. So the Continental Army is formed and commissioned under the command of General George Washington. And Washington was a very highly regarded figure, even by that point. He had been in the French and Indian War. He had been of service to the colonies for many years up to this point. And so he was, I believe, unanimously decided upon as the commander-in-chief for the Continental Army. And even at this point, the war has broken out. We've been at it for about a year, and Americans are still divided between patriots, loyalists, and neutrals. So we're not all on the same page. And so the colonists need to choose sides. So on the patriot side, you've got Nathaniel Greene, who's a pacifist Quaker, but he chooses to fight against the British even though he doesn't believe in fighting. And he says, "I'm determined to defend my rights and maintain my freedom or sell my life in the attempt. So he's basically saying he is willing to die for the cause of freedom. And then you've got loyalists like Charles Inglis, who is saying by a reconciliation with Britain and an end would be put to the present tumultuous war by which many lives have been lost and so many more must be lost if it continues. And these people are printing pamphlets and distributing them, trying to gain support for their cause. So when the war begins, the British have the clear military advantage. They're 400% larger, they're much more experienced, they're professionally trained. Not only that, but they've got much more money. They are the dominant navy in the world, and they've got a big manufacturing plan to make war supplies. Whereas we don't really have that. But the British underestimate the colonial commitment to independence. American colonists have an advantage by having a familiarity with the environment. They know the lay of the land. The British don't. They've got a commitment to win the war. They've got short supply lines for their soldiers so they can get supplies they need quicker when they're available. Unfortunately, they're not always available. And they've got a really good defensive strategy to just outlast the British. If we can just outlast them, we will win. And as leader of the Continental Army, George Washington was the symbol of the American cause. He had to build a professional army, he had to coordinate the militias, and he was the right man for the job because he had the military experience, whereas many others did not. He encouraged the common citizens and the volunteer soldiers to support the war even when the British seemed destined to win, even when the British were kicking our butts. He tried to instill a confidence in the soldiers to continue to fight. And this military is a ragtag army. They've got the Continental Army, which is your official military, but then you've got colonial militias, which are colony-based. So Virginia's got a militia, Massachusetts has a militia, things like that. And then you've got just civilian volunteers who have decided to be patriots and want to fight on the side of the Colonial Army. Not only do we have different ways, like the British have a bigger military, but yet the colonists have lay of the land knowledge. We've also got different military strategy. Washington's just trying to outlast the British, defend the lands, drag out the war, use guerrilla tactics if possible, and the biggest thing they need is an alliance with France. The French and the British already hate each other, right? So if we can make an alliance or a friendship with France, then we've got a chance with this. The British strategy is divide and conquer. Use the loyalists, seize the property, encourage slave revolts, because slavery is still very much a thing in the colonies, and divide the northern and southern colonies. Don't let them come together. But their biggest strategy is blockading the ports to prevent trade. If you can't get ships out, not only can you not trade with other countries, but you also can't get people out to go ask for help. Because at that point, we don't have airplanes. The only way to travel is by boat. And so if the British blockade all of our ports, we can't get ships out, we can't get people out, we can't really talk to anybody. So the revolution begins at Lexington and Concord, 1775. British victories in 1776 and 1777 really take a toll on colonial morale. American victory is starting to look impossible. Soldiers are starving because they can't get food, they can't get supplies. Things are looking pretty dire for the colonial military. And then in 1776, British soldiers just burn New York and start taking things. And that's another blow to colonial morale, because now their homes and their businesses are being burned to the ground. And that's enough to depress anybody. On Christmas Eve, 1776, Washington gives Americans hope with his famous crossing the Delaware. And the reason that he's crossing the Delaware on Christmas Eve is very strategic. He's going to surprise the British troops in Trenton, New Jersey, and if he can surprise them, maybe, just maybe, he can take out some of their forces. And so here's a very famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. Obviously, we don't have photos yet, so this is the best we have, the best rendering, but it's a very commanding pose by Washington as he's being rowed across the river and getting ready to surprise these British. And the surprise attack does actually work. And so from the beginning of this war, American diplomats are trying to form an alliance with France. And the best man for the job is Benjamin Franklin. He has lived in London, so he knows the British pretty well. He speaks French. And so they send Ben Franklin over there to drum up support to get the French monarchy to support us. And he goes over there and he's very rugged, even though Ben Franklin's not a rugged guy. He's not a frontiersman. He lived in Boston. He lived in Philadelphia. He lived in London. Like, he's a city guy. But he goes over there and he presents himself as this very rugged frontiersman, because that's what a lot of French people think that the colonial people are. And he's very personable and he builds relationships with the French. And the French was willing to support us. But at that point, they were like, we're not going to support you until we know you can actually win. Because the British had been winning the battles up to that point. So not only do we send Ben Franklin, eventually we send John Adams as well, and his son, John Quincy Adams. So you've got two future presidents on this arduous and long journey to France. And they're kind of watching how the battles are playing out. And of course, news takes a very long time to get back and forth, 2-3 weeks at the shortest. But the French finally agree to join our cause after the Battle of Saratoga of 1777. And that is the turning point. A turning point is when the tides turn in a situation. And in this case, the tide is turning in the favor of the colonists. And so the Battle of Saratoga is a turning point because the colonists begin to win. And the French agree to join us as our ally, as our friend. After Saratoga, French General the Marquis de Lafayette helps train American troops and gets them the training that they have been lacking, while the French Navy helps neutralize the British who had the advantage on the high seas, because the French also have a pretty good navy. So when French troops arrive in spring of 1778, the tide turns even more in favor of the Americans. So during the winter of 1777 to 1778, the Continental troops are in dire need of supplies. Hamilton, who is Washington's aide-de-camp, is writing letters to Continental Congress saying, we've got to have supplies. Our people are starving. Nothing comes. One advantage that they do have at Valley Forge over the course of the entire war is George Washington's wife, Martha Washington, throughout the summers, goes back to Mount Vernon and starts collecting supplies. And every year she comes back to Valley Forge and helps raise troop morale, feeds them, sews for them, nurses them, along with other officials' wives. And Washington and Lafayette at this point inspire and train the troops to continue to fight, even in these desperate situations. Here's some artists' renderings. It's cold. They're running low on food. They don't have the proper clothing. They don't have coats and things. And they're starving. But they make it through, inspired by Lafayette, inspired by Washington. And throughout 1778, 79, 80, and 81, victories are going back and forth. The British win some, the Americans win some, but the final conclusion comes at the Battle of Yorktown, 1781. And so I want to show you a little clip from America, the Story of Us that kind of gives you a better picture of the Battle of Yorktown.
What remains of the British Army is under siege in Yorktown. Trapped in the city, the Redcoats wait for reinforcements. But back in Britain, the war is unpopular and costing far too much money.
This is a case of hanging on in the face of the British actions long enough to where the British literally would grow weary of this and realize that it was endless.
This is Washington's chance to end the war with one decisive blow.
He committed to this idea of being able to stand on your own. See, America is a dream, and the only way to go get that dream is to show up and bring your very best to that moment and not stop until you bring that dream into existence.
Plum Martin will be one of the first over the top.
Godspeed. How you doing, old friend? Good. How are you? Good to check it out.
Behind Yorktown's defenses, 9,000 battle-hardened British troops are waiting. They're protected by a series of outlying cannon forts called redoubts. By October 14th, just 2 remain. If they're captured and their guns turned on Yorktown, the British will be forced to surrender.
Listen, look up there. It's time.
All the batteries in our line lay silent. We lay anxiously waiting for the signal.
Patriots race 100 yards to the British lines under fire and a hail of hand grenades. A force of 400 break through and storm the British fort. Fighting in close combat with bayonets, they beat the redcoats back.
Immediately after the fighting had ceased, I went out to see what had become of my wounded friend. He was dead.
34 of Martin's comrades lie dead or wounded. But they've breached Yorktown's defenses. 2 days later, the British surrender and begin negotiations for peace. For the past 6 years, leadership, training, weapons, and intelligence have been vital. The rebels have achieved the impossible. The United States is the only country to win independence from the British in war. But liberty comes at a price. Over 25,000 men have lost their lives in the battle for independence.
So at Yorktown in 1781, essentially the war is over. While the Treaty of Paris isn't for a couple of more years, General Cornwallis surrenders to George Washington, and Cornwallis's surrender is seen as the day the world turned upside down, because this is the first time in that time period that a country or a colony has won a war for independence against the British, who were the dominant navy in the world and the dominant country. And this little upstart country has just beat them. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 ends the American Revolution. And the reason it's in Paris is because France at that point in time is the diplomatic capital of the world. So Paris being its capital is where most treaties are negotiated. And this treaty gives Americans full independence, all territory east of the Mississippi River between Canada and Florida, as well as the removal of the British Army from U.S. claims in America. So all the British soldiers now have to leave the continent in any of the territories that are considered American territory. And so, as you can see, going back, here's North America in 1754. The British have quite a claim, so do the French. There's a little bit of disputed area. And then the Spanish claim most of Mexico into Central America, Florida. And then by 1763, French and Indian War, Britain has taken over a majority of the eastern portion of the continent as well as Canada. Alaska is being taken over by the Russians. Florida just has a tiny part in the Caribbean. And then by 1783, North America now has the United States. So everything from the East Coast all the way to the Mississippi River belongs to America, from Canada to Florida. Britain still controls Canada. Spanish still control the western portion of the United States, as well as Mexico into Central America and Florida, as well as parts of the Caribbean. But the United States is now on the map, and we've gained a significant amount of more land. We can go past the Appalachian Mountains. This brings us to the end of our discussion on the American Revolution. The next discussion will be over the Articles of Confederation. Thank you for watching, and I hope that you have a great day.